Okay, everyone. So let's give this most awkward of things a try as I go through here and try to give a lecture on pulmonary structure and pulmonary function to absolutely no one. So we will kind of briefly skim through some of this, and I'll give you guys some details on some other things to go in a little bit more depth. But hopefully, a lot of this is going to be a review of just kind of some basic anatomy and physiology of the system. We'll talk a little bit about the changes that take place during exercise. We'll talk about acid base buffering and kind of how we use CO2 carried in the blood as bicarbonate. And then we'll talk about something called the gas exchange threshold. Okay, so the idea behind breathing basically is that it should really be called pulmonary ventilation. Okay. People will often use this idea of ventilation, respiration, or breathing interchangeably. But what we are primarily doing with all of this is we are going to bring oxygen in from the atmosphere into our lungs. And then we're going to take the carbon dioxide that has been given up out of venous blood into the lungs and breathe it out. Okay. So, really, the purpose of pulmonary ventilation is for gas exchange. Okay. We're bringing oxygen in, we're getting rid of CO2. And that's the big primary function of all of this. All right. A secondary purpose and a secondary function of all of this that is also quite important is that we're going to use pulmonary ventilation to help us regulate acid base balance, especially during high intensity exercise. Okay, so when we talk about pulmonary ventilation, we really are going to break it into four components. Okay, the first of those is the idea of breathing, or what is sometimes called the ventilation portion. Okay, and so we tend to abbreviate this as V little e. Let me see if I can write on here. Okay, it's V underscore E. And so ventilation is the number of breaths that you take in a minute, which is going to be your breathing frequency, multiplied by something called tidal volume. And tidal volume is going to represent the amount of air that you're moving in or out during each breath. So tidal volume is the pulmonary analog of stroke volume, and breathing frequency is the pulmonary analog of heart rate. And so those two things multiplied together give us ventilation, or give us the amount of air that we're moving. Okay, once we've moved some air, then we need to actually have diffusion take place so that we can exchange O2 and CO2 between the lungs and the blood. All right, in general, we're going to bring oxygen in and get oxygen into the blood, and we're going to have CO2 from the blood, give it into the lungs, and then breathe it off. Okay. Once we've put the oxygen into the blood, we've got to worry about gas transport, how we're going to get things from the lungs into other tissues where we need it. And that's primarily going to be driven by hemoglobin. So we'll talk a little bit about hemoglobin and hemoglobin dissociation. And then the final piece of this is what we sometimes call internal respiration. And that's going to be the diffusion or the exchange of O2 and CO2 between the blood and the cells where metabolism is occurring. So really in this instance, think about cells that are going to be in skeletal muscle. Okay. Okay. So in our respiratory or pulmonary system, our primary structures are going to be the lungs, and then the alveoli, which are the small air sacs that are going to be part of the lungs, and then the pulmonary capillaries that are going to surround all of those. So as you can see in our picture here, we have our big structure, which is the lungs. And then as we brink down on all of those, we're going to have these branching structures in the lungs, and they're going to all end in these little small air sacs that are called alveoli. And each alveoli is going to be surrounded by this very, very large network of what we call pulmonary capillaries. And so at the alveoli capillary interface is where almost all of the gas exchange is going to occur. Okay. So the mechanics of breathing, this idea of inspiration and expiration, air is going to move simply by differences in air pressure. So when you do inspiration, you are going to lower the pressure inside the chest cavity, open your mouth, and so pressure inside becomes lower than pressure on the outside, and air wants to move in. During expiration, as we relax the diaphragm, we're going to shrink the area in our lungs back down. That's going to raise the pressure on the inside. Pressure in the chest cavity will be higher than atmospheric air pressure outside, and so air is going to want to move out. This is going to be a nice cartoon that's going to walk you through sort of what happens, and you can see then what the changes that are going to take place with the diaphragm. Okay, here you have rest, there we have inspiration and expiration, and then it's also going to show you the relative, okay, the relative sort of air pressures inside and outside of the lungs and how those are going to change as we inspire and we expire. So I present all of these terms, but I want you all to know that you do not have to know them, okay? You don't have to know these. I'm just going to write that on here. Don't have to know. But I want to present them because when we make measurements of lung function, when we do this thing called spirometry, these are going to be all of the variables that we could potentially measure. Oh, excuse me. All this talk of breathing is making me sleepy. So just keep these things in mind. This is going to show you when you were doing a spirometry test, which maybe some of you did as undergrads and you may do as part of the exercise phys lab class. I don't remember, but it just kind of shows you here would be regular breathing, right? Inspiration, expiration. We're going to go in, out, in, out, in, out, right? And you're going to go big, suck in as much air as you possibly can. That's going to be this inspiratory reserve. Then you can have kind of forced expiration and things like that, where you're going to force air out down in this particular way. Okay. We can measure changes in all of these things to tell us things about proper pulmonary function. If you have asthma, if you have COPD, if you have emphysema, if you have cystic fibrosis or something, then there's going to be noticeable changes in these, and that's going to tell us something about how well your pulmonary system is going to function. Okay, so I want to show all of these simply because I think it's really interesting, okay, when we look at things that we measure during a spirometry test, look at our values for all of these measures that we, of course, don't have to know between runners and controls. And what you see is that basically lots of aerobic training does not change pulmonary function, okay? Your total ventilation is going to be basically the same, right? Your total surface area in your lungs, basically the same. Tidal volume, the same. Breathing rate, the same. There's essentially no differences. And so, as I know we've already talked about to some extent during our talking about training with the aerobic system, very, very few adaptations occur in the pulmonary system. You kind of have whatever you have. Where things get to be a problem is when we have some sort of pathology. Okay, so in the absence of pathology, training doesn't do much for us. So this is going to be kind of how we're going to look at lung volumes and blood flow. And this is just trying to show in many ways what is happening, okay, as to how much air is getting down to the alveoli. You can see blood flow coming through by the alveoli. You can see how much air total you're moving, okay, and how much of that you will note that this total is about 7,500 or 7.5 liters per minute. But you will note that not all of that air makes it actually down into the alveoli, okay? And then you can see what we're getting from sort of pulmonary capillary flow and what's going to come through there, okay? You don't have to know any of these numbers. Again, this is just for illustrative purposes as I try to show you guys that we breathe air in, not all of it makes it to the alveoli. And then once it gets to the alveoli, not all of that is going to be able to diffuse, but we're pretty good at doing a lot of those kinds of things, okay? So factors that contribute to gas diffusion. And so this is specifically going to be what's happening at the movement of oxygen and CO2 between the capillaries and the alveoli. Okay, and so what you can see is that we've got the molecular weight of our thing. There's some solubility factor that's going to play a big role here. And what we find is that carbon dioxide is very, very soluble in water. Oxygen is much less soluble in water. And what we know then is that it's much easier. Okay, that's the point of this darker line here, is because CO2 is very, very soluble in water, it's much easier for us to diffuse the CO2. And what that's going to work out to be is that we need a much smaller gradient. We need a much smaller difference in the concentrations of CO2 between the blood and the air in the alveoli in order for CO2 to move. Okay, and that's going to become important a little bit later on. For oxygen, we need a much larger gradient, which is going to be okay because we can generate these really, really big gradients with oxygen as we move things along. Okay, so here's the ideas of the conducting zone and the respiratory zones. These are pretty straightforward kinds of things, right? In the conducting zone, we are mostly moving the air, okay? There's no actual gas exchange there. All of the gas exchange is going to occur in the respiratory zone, the vast majority of that in those places in the alveolar sacs. Okay, so you are going to have some space, right, in the lungs that we call dead space, okay? And so when we perform ventilation, when you're breathing air in and you're breathing air out, you're going to bring air through both the dead space and the alveoli, okay? So total ventilation is equal to dead space ventilation and alveolar ventilation added together, okay? And so the dead space, at its most basic, is just this idea that part of every breath that you take, the air is going to stay in the conducting zone. It's not going to make it all the way down into the alveolar sacs. Therefore, not all of the air that you breathe in with every breath is going to be available for pulmonary diffusion. Okay. If you have improper function in your lungs and things, then dead space ventilation can go up, and that can be bad for gas exchange. But in general, in most people, okay, your dead space ventilation is not that much, and it's going to be pretty consistent. So when we get gas exchange in the alveoli, okay, it occurs across something that we call the respiratory membrane. The respiratory membrane is going to be the layer of cells, or the double layer of cells, where the capillary here, okay, as I'm drawing in, where the capillary meets the edge of the alveoli. That two-cell layer, the outside layer of the capillaries and the outside layer of the alveoli, where they meet, that's called the respiratory membrane. And it's going to be across the respiratory membrane that, in general, we've got carbon dioxide here in the blood. It's going to move in. We've got O2 here in the lungs, and it's going to move primarily onto the hemoglobin there. Okay, so that's the respiratory membrane. It's the site of gas exchange. This is just going to be a electron micrograph of the respiratory membrane. Here you have the capillary side. Here you have the alveolar side. Okay, and so then what you can see is that we would move things across in both directions across that layer. Because it's so small, it's easy for diffusion to take place. Okay, so we've talked a lot about pulmonary diffusion already. The primary thing that makes the gases move is the difference in what we call a partial pressure of that gas from one side of the respiratory membrane to the other. Okay, and so the idea behind partial pressures is going to take us back to chemistry. So if we know that there is a certain amount of air around us, okay, that air exerts a pressure on us. So if we were at sea level, which in Oklahoma we're not too far from sea level, Standard atmospheric air pressure, excuse me. Standard atmospheric air pressure is about 760 millimeters of mercury. Okay. If we want to calculate the partial pressure of any particular gas in the air, that partial pressure is going to be equal to the percentage of air that is made up of that gas multiplied by the atmospheric pressure. So if we assume that we're at sea level, nitrogen makes up 79.04%. So about 79% of air is nitrogen. So we take 760, we multiply it by the percentage of the air that is nitrogen, and that gives us this number of about 600 millimeters of mercury. So nitrogen has in atmospheric air and partial pressure of about 600 millimeters of mercury. Oxygen is not quite 21%, so it's going to have a partial pressure of about 159. Carbon dioxide, there's almost no CO2 in the air, so it has this very, very small partial pressure that's going to be there. So if we want to move gases from one side of the respiratory membrane to the other, we need there to be a difference in the partial pressures. So we need the partial pressure of oxygen to be lower inside the pulmonary capillaries than 159, which would then result in this oxygen wanting to move from inside the alveoli over into the capillaries. Conversely, we want the partial pressure of carbon dioxide to be higher in the capillaries than this 0.2 that it is in the lungs. That will, that would then allow it to be able to move. And remember, because carbon dioxide is so soluble in water, it's much easier for it to move if we have very small partial pressure gradients. So this is just going to show you guys the rough concentrations of oxygen and CO2 in arterial blood, okay? So blood leaving the lung going back to the heart, and venous blood, or blood that has come from the right ventricle and has just now arrived at the lungs. And so what you will note is that in venous blood, oxygen is at about 40 millimeters of mercury. And then when it leaves the lungs, it's at about 100. Okay. So in alveolar air, there's about 105 millimeters of mercury of O2 partial pressure. Venous blood is at about 40, and this is at rest, okay? So there's this very, very large diffusion gradient for oxygen. So oxygen is going to want to move from the alveoli into the capillaries. Now, conversely, CO2, our diffusion gradient, is much smaller. It's only about 6 millimeters of mercury. So venous blood has about 46 millimeters of mercury of carbon dioxide in it. And then the alveolar air has only about 40. But because CO2 is so soluble in water, this 6 millimeter gradient is going to be plenty for us to be able to diffuse CO2 out. That shows basically the same thing. Okay. Now let's talk about, once we've brought the oxygen into the blood, how are we going to carry it in blood from the lungs out to the tissues where we're going to need it? Well, the vast majority of oxygen is going to be bound to hemoglobin. Okay. About 98% of all the oxygen in your body is found on hemoglobin. And then you have a very, very small percent, only about 2%, that is going to be dissolved in the blood plasma. Okay. The fact that we have hemoglobin in our red blood cells allows the blood to transport about 70 times more oxygen than if it was only going to be dissolved in plasma alone. Okay. Our hemoglobin saturation typically is going to be between 96 and 98%. So it's very, very highly saturated. It's rarely ever going to be 100%, but 96 to 98 is way, way more saturated than what our bodies are going to require. Okay. Because of this, in most people, in most circumstances, the blood's ability to bind and carry oxygen is rarely ever going to be a limiting factor in exercise performance. This just shows the binding of oxygen onto hemoglobin. Okay, you guys don't have to know this structure, but again, I like to present this just in case people care. Okay. So, one of the things that we know that happens as a consequence of aerobic exercise training is we're going to get a larger blood volume. Okay. And because we get a larger blood volume, you will note here, blood volume went from about 5.25 liters to almost 6.5 liters. Okay. The concentration of hemoglobin, or the percentage really of red blood cells in either of those, is going to be the same. Okay, pre to post training. But the simple fact that we have more blood, right, means there's more red blood cells. We have this significantly increase, like a 25% increase in the amount of red blood cells. And so, because that goes up 25%, we can now carry 25% more oxygen. So, very, very powerful adaptations. This is something called the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. And so what it's trying to show you guys is here is PaO2, okay, or so partial pressure of oxygen that we're going to have. And as that comes out here, basically near to 100%, okay, what you guys will see is that we are going to have very, very near to 100% binding of oxygen onto hemoglobin, okay? And so that's going to be good. This means that oxygen is going to tend to want to go there. And then as we're going to make the partial pressure of oxygen fall, which is what's going to happen out in peripheral tissues during exercise, then hemoglobin is going to want to leave, or oxygen is going to want to leave the hemoglobin, okay, and come off into our particular tissues. Okay. Conversely, right, we've got oxygen carried on hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide is a little bit different. We have about 10% or so of our CO2 that's going to be dissolved in the blood plasma. We have up to a third of our CO2 will bind to hemoglobin. This is called carb amino hemoglobin. And then the vast majority, though, of the CO2 that we carry around in our blood that we're moving from our tissues to try to get it back to the lungs is going to be carried as what we call bicarbonate ions. And so we get bicarbonate when we combine CO2 with water. So CO2 diffuses out of your muscles, out of a tissue, into the capillaries. Once it gets into the bloodstream, then blood plasma, blood has lots of water in it. CO2 combines with water. It makes something called carbonic acid, which is H2CO3. And then carbonic acid is going to dissociate into this, okay, which is HCO minus, which is called bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is a buffer. Bicarbonate is a basic ion, okay? And by basic, I don't mean that it likes to drink coffee and do yoga or something like that. What I mean is that it is the opposite of an acid, okay? It's going to be something that we can use to buffer and neutralize acidity, okay? So this is just going to show kind of how we're going to have CO2 transport, right? You're making it inside the muscle cell over here. Some of it just gets dissolved and it goes right into the blood. Some of it is going to be bound onto these carbaminohemoglobin. Okay, so some of the CO2 gets bound to hemoglobin. And then this is going to show what also happens then is that it gets into the bloodstream, it combines with water, and essentially then we're going to end up with this. Okay, HCO3 minus, we're going to end up with bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion out of those kinds of things. And then once that gets to the lung, it's going to combine back with the hydrogen ion. It's going to reverse this entire reaction, and we're going to make CO2 back, and you're going to breathe that CO2 off. Okay, more of the same kinds of things. Let's talk about respiratory changes with exercise. Pretty straightforward, okay? Both breathing frequency and breathing depth increase with exercise. Obviously, these are changes that have to take place. Can you imagine trying to run a race while holding your breath or something? If your breathing frequency and depth didn't go up, we would not be able to remove CO2 properly. We would not be able to bring in enough oxygen to supply it to our working muscles. So, the control of breathing, especially during exercise, is going to be a very, very important kind of thing. Okay. In general, breathing tends to be controlled by the hypothalamus. which I don't know why that wasn't written on here, but it's controlled by the hypothalamus, okay? And so there are places in the hypothalamus that we call the respiratory centers. Those respiratory centers here, oh, sorry, we've got hypothalamus, and then the respiratory centers are going to actually be down here in the medulla. Okay, my apologies. But there's going to be input into the medulla from chemoreceptors, okay, that are going to be found here in the carotid arteries and in the aorta. You're going to have stretch receptors in the lungs. We're going to have proprioceptors out in muscle tissues, okay? And then some other issues with firing from the motor cortex and some central brain-related chemoreceptors. But all of these things are going to get a certain amount of input, and they're going to tell the respiratory center to increase breathing frequency and increase breathing depth, which is going to drive this increase in ventilation that we need during exercise. Okay, so this is just going to show some of kind of how all of that works, okay? And it's going to tell us in many ways kind of where the feedback is coming from. Is it coming from a mechanoreceptor and then metaboreceptors? So the metaboreceptors are mostly going to sense changes in metabolic byproduct buildup. The mechanoreceptors are going to sense stretch in the lungs and in the periphery. And then we're also going to get feedback from what we call our carotid chemoreceptors. And the big thing that they were going to sense, okay, the primary ion that drives changes in breathing is going to be carbon dioxide. As carbon dioxide production goes up, then partial pressure of CO2 in the blood, or in arterial blood especially, is going to rise just a small amount, and that's going to stimulate more frequent and deeper breathing. Okay, so that kind of talks about those things there. This is pulmonary ventilation. And so what you can see is there is what we would call sort of a phase 1 increase in breathing, and then what there might be then a phase 2 increase in breathing. When you start to exercise, there's going to be almost immediate input to the respiratory centers from proprioceptors and from stretch receptors. It's going to see, ooh, we're moving, we better breathe more deeply and more frequently. Then, as your exercise bout is going to continue, and as it is going to kind of get up and maybe level off, then you're going to experience those changes in carbon dioxide levels in the blood, and that's going to drive a lot of that phase 2 change in breathing. So much like heart rate, breathing is going to tend to go up pretty fast, and then it ought to level off at a steady state. Okay. Some breathing irregularities. These are pretty straightforward. Now let's talk about something called the ventilatory equivalent for oxygen. There's also something called the ventilatory equivalent of carbon dioxide. Okay. So the ventilatory equivalent is very, very simply the ratio between ventilation and oxygen consumption. So as you can imagine, then the ventilatory equivalent for CO2 is VE, right, divided by the amount of CO2 that we're breathing off, okay? And so what this is going to give us an idea of is how much oxygen are we using per the amount of breathing that's going on, or how much CO2 is being produced per the amount of breathing that is going to go on. And this is going to give us some ideas of how well we're matching things, okay? So we will use the ventilatory equivalents of oxygen and CO2 to help us to identify changes that are taking place in ventilation during exercise. And so one of the things that we're going to be looking for is something called the ventilatory breakpoint. Okay. This is the point during intense exercise when ventilation will begin to increase disproportionately, okay, to oxygen consumption. If we assume that we use a certain amount of oxygen and therefore we make a certain amount of CO2 at the end of at the end of the Krebs cycle with all of that, then there should be this relatively linear, relatively constant relationship. Well, what we find is that as work rate increases, as we get up and over lactate threshold, what happens with ventilation is that ventilation is going to disproportionately increase in relation to oxygen consumption, okay? And that is going to be because we are going to produce hydrogen ions from the production of lactic acid. Those hydrogen ions are going to combine with bicarbonate, right? And then when that gets into the lung, then we're going to precipitate out CO2 and water. It's going to push this reaction to the right, okay? And so we now have CO2 that's driving increases in ventilation. And we have CO2 coming directly from the Krebs cycle, from aerobic metabolism. But now we also have additional CO2 that's being driven out of the blood by the fact that we are making lactic acid. Okay, so we have metabolic CO2 and then we have buffered CO2. So you have more CO2 being produced than what's being produced in metabolism. And that extra CO2 is going to drive a further increase in breathing. Okay, and so it's going to look something like this. So here is running velocity here on the x-axis, and we've got ventilation or oxygen consumption here on the y. And so what you will note, here's our nice kind of linear increase in oxygen consumption as running velocity increases. But if we graph ventilation, it does one thing for a while and it has a relatively steady slope. But then you're going to get to here and the slope of that increase in breathing changes, and you can note that the slope tends to become much, much steeper. Okay. This point right here is the ventilatory breakpoint. What that tells us is that somewhere, maybe about right here or so, we began to make lactic acid. That began to get buffered by the bicarbonate ions, and that drove an increase in breathing. Okay. So if you look at some of these kinds of things, and you want to make a graph basically of this is the graph of VCO2 or CO2 production to oxygen consumption, right? If you graph those things during a VO2 max test, it looks like this. We're going to do something called the V-slope method. And so you kind of fit a line to these early ones, and then you can figure out about where does that second breakpoint take place. Okay, it's even more obvious when you graph VO2 and VCO2 here, and they essentially put an extension line on what's going on there, and then you can note how it begins to kind of tick upwards. All right. Okay. Are there respiratory limitations to performance? So can pulmonary function limit performance? And the answer is maybe. Okay, maybe. Under most circumstances, as long as we're not at altitude, and as long as the person doesn't have some sort of pulmonary pathology, ventilation is usually not going to be a limiting factor. In highly trained people, maybe it can be, but in general, for most people, that's not going to be the issue. Okay. However, diffusion, okay, at the alveoli, or perfusion or providing blood to the alveoli, these two things may be a limiting factor. Okay, we cannot get enough air in or out because we can't get enough blood flow there. That may be a bigger issue, much more so than simply the mechanics of breathing. Okay, all right. So here's just going to show us kind of some changes in those things. O2 and CO2 diffusion, don't worry about those couple of things. All right, so it's really pretty straightforward, guys. What we need to know is what drives the increase in breathing. It's mostly increases in CO2, a little bit of increases in movement and hydrogen ions. We're going to try to bring oxygen in because of its partial pressure gradients, and we're going to try to get CO2 out because of its partial pressure gradients. Okay. All right, that's it for our quick whirlwind tour of pulmonary ventilation or breathing.